The nomad approached the compound which he had been seeking. The man who he was trying to find was located nearly inside. Enrique Guzman. I would never do anything to hurt the people of Zanesville, he claimed. I love my Zanesville, and I care very much about the people who live there. I never wanted to see anyone hurt. To prove his point, he buttered the offer with 19 chips. Cal's got a right to be angry with me, but not for the poisoning. It didn't have anything to do with that. So what? I asked. A guy wandered into town a few days before people got started sick. He was looking for work. His name was Paul Burard. He vanished right after Luther Jordan took ill and died. I think Polly slipped the poison into our food. My best bet is he's with the travelers looking around the old airport near town. The stranger, compelled by some odd sense of justice, agreed to track down this man and clean Enrique's name. Pickup trucks, marvelously practical on the outsides. The wanderer set off towards where he knew he would find the man, or at least where he thought he knew he'd find the man. You can never be too certain about what people tell you. On the way he continued his hunt for chickens, knowing that he'd be paid well for their feathers and whatever he could strip off of their dead bodies when he got back into town. This particular specimen yielded some organic chemicals which he bottled for the scientists that are quite taken with exploring the wastes, but can never actually seem to do any of the exploring themselves. Perhaps due to a general disliking of killing. Or maybe due to the fact that they were all bloody weaklings. One or the other. All the wanderer knew is he would be getting good chips for doing this. Whenever he returned to town, that is. It could take months, weeks, depending on his disposition. He had everything he needed to survive in the wasteland. A trench coat, an axe in case he ran out of bullets, and a gun with bullets. Lots of bullets. While hunting the chickens, he stumbled upon their nest. He decided to take a look inside quite quickly, before any of them would return. He scrounged around, looking through all the scrap that he knew the chickens made their eggs out of, but could only find eggs, and nothing of use. Stripping 2 more chickens, he decided he'd probably be best off not circling back around to take care of the other chickens that are still laying around somewhere. And would continue towards his objective. The wanderer grabbed some meat off the final chicken and made his way towards his objective. Another chicken stood in his way, however. Didn't pose much of a threat. Not to him, at least. Was armed with all the knowledge that he would need to survive in the wastes, having been here already for a number of days since he woke from the cloning vats. Oh, the wastes. The beautiful wastes. He decided to circle around the town rather than going through it. He didn't really like people that much. He was more of an outdoors kind of person. And for that, the waste was the perfect place. He loved going through all of its corners, finding all of its secrets, and just being wonderfully alone. Just him in the countryside, and whatever mutated, abhorrent animals, or I guess if you could still call them animals, might be wandering around the Central Plains. He knew all the shortcuts through the mountains and hills. He'd taken them hundreds of times before. He knew exactly how to avoid town and exactly how to get into it. The only two things he really needed to know. He knew these hills were rich with chemical deposits, but he wasn't sure how to mine them. You couldn't just strike at them with a conventional pick. They were far too unstable for that. On the plains below, he spotted more chickens. These slightly bigger than the ones that he had previously encountered. He paused for a moment to consider whether an encounter would be wise or not, and then continued on his way towards his objective. His current goal. He kind of pondered why in the devil he would ever take such a quest. I mean, honestly, it's talking to a person, not really anything of his caliber of work per se. Nothing that would actually interest him at any point in time either. He found the satellite dish, which was the first telltale sign that he'd gotten to the right place. Looks like he'd have to drop by the town after all. Or as little of it as he could. The man that he was looking for insisted on a more hostile version of negotiations than he had originally intended. That wasn't really a problem for him. He looted an egg, some water, and some cotton off the corpse, and decided to leave. It was about that time again. The woman, or I guess the girl would be a better name for her, who had originally sent him on this fool's errand, wanted to talk to him, though she was back in town. He could have cut through the airstrip, fighting through all the petty traveler thugs that dwelled within, but he decided to take his way, the nomad's way, and fight his way through the wastelands. He wondered if he could perhaps find anything of interest in this pile of tires, and decided to shovel through it, trying to find any usable rubber scraps, or anything in general. See, in the wasteland, everything had to be handmade. There was nothing left over from the previous world except for little scraps, little bits and pieces strewn about everywhere. And that is exactly what he was looking for. The satellite dish proved to be far more interesting, with some junk technology laying at the base. Inside he found some gears. He knew those would prove useful. They could be used to craft mechanisms of guns, moving joints and heavier armor, and a whole host of other things. He met another plains wanderer, just standing atop a hill next to the horse. He didn't really care much to say hi. He wasn't a sociable type. The wanderer continued on, following his path and his path alone. Skirting the Zanesville airstrip still, he decided that perhaps it would be best that he check around for some more interesting scrap. Another pile of tires presented itself. That wasn't what he was really after. He wanted to get to the platform, see if there was any helicopter bits laying around, or anything else that could really be of interest. Found a corpse, and not quite what he was intending to find. This young woman had wandered a little too far from town with nothing on her. It looked like she had already been stripped of all of her possessions, but he decided to check if he could find anything of use. Unfortunately, the only thing of interest was a little bit of scrap cotton that he could scavenge from her clothing. And that is the kind of world that it had turned into. He didn't really remember or actually know anything of the world before this. He'd woken up brutally during an invasion of a cloning vat 4 years previous. Decided to search through the car on the bridge, certain that it had been searched hundreds of times before, but maybe he could find something that others had missed. Some scrap rubber came from the tires, and that was about it. He was a clone, and everyone knew it. There was a collar infused into his neck that would keep him anchored to the cloning system, which no longer worked anyways. So it was just a sign that marked him as an outcast in any town that he went into. So he avoided towns and people. He didn't really need them much. He had everything he needed to survive. He knew how to craft some basic weaponry, how to make his own food, how to make the food that he found edible. And he didn't really need much more than that. This town filled with all these people. It didn't really bring him any joy or satisfaction to be here. But hey, he was here at some point. Originally.
Give me your attention. Stay the course.
So, now this same fool who sent him out wanted me to use a sample kit. Ish. So I was back to the airports. A stranger wandered. Oh, the things people do for money. Now, one might think that money's no good anymore. And that's quite right. But it'll still carry you a long way if you know how to use it. The poker chips that had become today's currency were quite difficult to find on their own, if not impossible in the wastes. Most of the thugs out there barely even carried them on them. However, sometimes it'd be just more efficient to use chips to buy what the wanderer needed, and so it was that he talked to people. Talked to them for the sake of getting chips, and nothing more. As he was passing by, he noticed there was a man on the bridge. A woman, really.
Open your ears and keep your head down. Thank you. Excelsior.
Wants you to kill ragged coyotes. So, the woman on the bridge wanted him to kill coyotes, and she wanted him to do that fast. So he decided to look through another car on his way back. Other people's rules had no effect on him. He didn't really care much for the woman or for anything else. But he knew that this would lead to money. Money, and perhaps something else. The original man who had sent him to this woman, well, he was in town too. And he was the one who gave him guns in the first place, when he was just fresh out of the cloning vat, running through the wastes. He also gave him a horse. A very useful thing to have in the wastes, all things considered. Said to get up onto his horse and ride. It would get him to the coyotes faster, and would get him back here a lot faster too. There's no reason to waste time on foot when one could be on a horse. Surprisingly enough, horses had somehow survived mutation-free through all the nuclear war, through all the wastes, through everything, the ruin, the rubble, the apparent lack of edible plant life. And he was fine with that. He was perfectly happy riding his horse through the wastes. He found the animals in question, dismounted from his horse, knew that it was about time to start the task. The wanderer's aim faltered. Perhaps it was just the heat. Or maybe he just wasn't as good with his artificial eyes as he thought he was. The coyotes fell quickly before his expert trigger finger, most of them not even having a chance to move from the spot where they stood before he'd pumped enough rounds into them to permanently disable their small dog-like forms. They fell to the ground with a whimper. He scavenged their hides, their claws, their teeth, whatever he could. Some of it could actually come in handy later on. Coyote hides were quite useful in the makings of various clothings. Plus the woman would give him caps for this task. And chips. Poker chips. Not all coyotes had a good enough hide. Sometimes he had punctured it entirely too many times to make it salvageable. In those cases, he'd just go right ahead and take the meat, skin it off their bones. It could be used as food later. When he was out in the wastes, with nothing better to eat. Cooked over a campfire, inside some abandoned cave. Or maybe recently abandoned, after a couple shots. That was just the way of the wastes. Nothing else to it. Sometimes he wondered how the woman would knew that he was being honest when he said he had killed the coyotes. Besides from... I mean, it is entirely possible that his gunfire did not go unheard, or the sudden drop in population go unnoticed. But just in case, he decided to take their teeth with him. 10 sets of teeth, 10 dead coyotes. One final creature was doomed to fall, and now he could leave, resting, relaxed, knowing that he'd taken care of his task and he'd taken care of it well. Way faster than the arbitrary time limit imposed. On a bonus, the woman was also on the way back to his original destination. He mounted his horse again and galloped off. Back where he came, back through town and across the bridge. He thought this time maybe he wouldn't leave his horse in town. Maybe he'd tie it up at one of the little shacks on the bridge. It'd be safe from the elements there, safe from other people trying to steal it. Because very generally, that is what people do with their time. Not everyone was quite an honest of a worker as he, though admittedly killing things is not the most honest of works. It is work, in the sense that it is a pre-agreed agreement, in which both parties incur some benefit. The wastes were not free of all sorts of pillagers, scum and criminals that served only themselves and profited through the misfortune of others. He had to slow his horse to pass through the gap onto the bridge, and just as he thought, he'd just leave it right in one of the sheds. No problems, no questions asked. The horse would be fine. It had been recently fed, so it had still had plenty of time. He reloaded his weapon and decided to search through a car. Why not? Maybe he'd find something else of interest. Scrap of steel this time. Not bad at all.
Maintain discipline. This is important. Double time.
This time she wanted him to hunt down some chickens. He refused the offer temporarily. He had other things to do. Specifically, at the airstrip. He told the man that he'd put his chemicals into the barrel, and that meant that he would. He was an honest mercenary, doing honest work. The thugs were lightly armed, but their armaments were nothing compared to his, especially given their lack of proper training, apparently. As evidenced by their wondrous aim. Or lack thereof, I guess, would be a better term. The man took everything the thugs had on them. They wouldn't need it anyways. In his sights, he saw the barrel that the man was talking about. Across the way from several thugs. He'd take care of them. Couple of shots to the head and the thugs would easily fall. They weren't tough. They were just little kids made into men through time. Canteens, scrap irons, granola bars. They had nothing of great value, but just the small necessary things of life. Traveler had forgotten to keep track of how much ammunition he had in his gun, but it didn't really matter. They were poor shots, and his heavy leather trench coat kept the little metal slugs that they shot at him well in check. He got ready to use the sample kit given to him on the barrel. Stepped back, just in case. You never know what could happen. And that was it. His job here was done. That car was too stripped down to even be of interest. He decided to pass it and keep going back. Talk to the woman about felling some chickens. He knew exactly where they were anyways. It wouldn't have been much trouble. And may have even been on his way. He had gotten an offer recently to construct himself an all-terrain vehicle. However, he knew that fuel for it would be too difficult to come by as compared to horse feed. So he'd stick with his horse. Plus moving parts tend to break.
That's an order.
Constantly going around fixing things. It wasn't his bit in life. And their scavenger was looking through an already pretty scavenged, beaten up old truck on the bridge. He decided to leave him be. He wasn't that interested in some rusted out old pickup. And yet again, he'd have to skirt town. He was thinking about skirting town, but then realized that perhaps it would be better to drop by and talk to the man who owed him some money. He had, after all, done the job as asked. Town was still the same shithole of poorly constructed metal bungalows, filthy broken streets with brush growing through the cracks. The same exact people doing absolutely nothing.
The enforcer. Be careful. I need a vote. Onward and upward.
The toxic sample had in fact cleared the man, and since the man was located so close to the chickens, the wanderer felt like he had a pretty good chance of taking care of the chickens first, and then dropping by the hut to tell the old man that his name was cleared. Maybe then he'd go see the daughter and tell her to stop worrying so much. He passed her on his way out of town. And then again, he had forgotten about the distinctly tall fence going around the whole perimeter. He'd be forced to navigate around it. The broken down old thing still served decently well as a defense, so it was kept up. Between the fence and the hills, no one really bothered with the place. Town wasn't worth anything anyways. In the distance he could see a crane. He wondered what it had been used to build, while it was just standing alone, derelict in the desert. Multiple cranes, actually. It'd be something that he'd check into probably in the future. For now, though, he had other things to attend to, namely some chickens. He was going to be cutting it close on this one. The private really wanted these chickens dead, and she wanted them dead fast. It would have probably been smarter to take his horse along, but he really didn't feel like it at the time. Would have been a waste, he thought. No need to tire my horse out before the day's done. Well, who knows? Maybe it would have saved him in the end. Chickens fell as before. This time, though, he wouldn't have the time to scavenge their remains. He decided to just move through it quickly, methodically, killing the damn abominations before they got anywhere near town. He plowed through the chickens, getting closer and closer to their nest, leaving a wake of bodies behind. Didn't really matter. No one would miss them. Or specifically, the chickens that would miss them were already dead. Crappy little lead bullets in his gun weren't propelled fast enough by the compressed air container to actually go anywhere beyond 30 meters. They just hit the chicken's thick skin and plank right off, forcing him to get closer before taking his shots. One more chicken. One last chicken. And he could go home. With the chicken down, he decided to circle around town, go in through the other side, drop by the old man's hut, tell him that his name had been cleared, see how happy he was about that. Or maybe given the amount of time he had to return, he wouldn't. He would just go straight to the bridge and then jump off the side. Cut back through all the mountain paths that he knew, as well as the back of his hand. Stranger wasn't really sure. He didn't have a supreme goal in life, or anything to accomplish, really. He was just running around, having fun. Saw an interesting looking pile of junk metal on his way back. He decided to give it a look through. He could use some more metal. Maybe he'd find something fit for a barrel. The stranger continued onwards, having to pass through a town that he hated so much for the umpteenth time today. Said not shaping up a good day. Too much contact with other people. Too many goddamn people everywhere. Just crowding around the streets, walking through town on dumb business of their own. Saw an interesting man in a gas mask run towards him. The rest of the people here that were not part of the town guard were poorly dressed. Simple clothing, shorts, pants, things that wouldn't do too well in the wilderness at all. Circled around the bus again. Found a thug's corpse lying at the head of the bridge. That was an interesting development. Wasn't there when he'd come through last. And he didn't really think that thugs would be daring enough to cross this bridge, given the fact that it's all protected and under construction. Construction for what? With what? Didn't really see signs of anything moving. Just little wooden ramps being erected. Served no purpose at all. The underside of the bridge was made of reinforced concrete and old rusted metal. The only way it stayed up is lack of direct impact and well, the absence of any cars driving across it.
I have something to say. Keep your head down.
The woman paid him his money, just as agreed, and sent him on another mission. This one involved killing a man. Very specific man. So perhaps all those others that he had to kill, all those animals, they were just testing him. They weren't there for any supreme purpose. He did notice that he was running quite low on ammo though. He decided to take a little pause, craft some more. Didn't have enough copper. Figures. It's always the way things are. Never enough of anything. That is the rule of the wastes. Oh well. He'd stop by, pick up some more copper on his horse, then go and talk to the man whose life he was supposed to end. He knew where to find the things that he needed. He knew this land well. He'd been wandering around it for quite some time now. He hadn't really moved on in the wastes. He did buy himself a map that showed him where everything was, but he stuck around Zanesville for now. There were still things to do here, still people to get money out of. No point in moving on until the towns run dry. That was his thought. No point in moving on at all. He saw the copper nose that he was looking for, right at the base of the hills on which the town sat. He knew they'd be there. 2 scrap copper, exactly what he needed. Start crafting his ammunition now. It'd take him some time to complete, but he'd have it when he really needed it. He left the rest of the copper nodes alone, went on with his mission to find and kill one Juan de Simon, a diseased man Or so he'd been told. You can never really trust people's stories before the apocalypse, much more after. The world hadn't gotten honest, and just gotten simpler. Regressed in technology. Lost all the little niceties. The running water, the showers, the indoor plumbing. Little televisions that you could sit at and mindlessly stare your day away. But no, the world hadn't gotten more honest. It just gotten worse. There's no primitive beauty. There's no great simplicity to life that makes it all better. People are still the same. In fact, maybe they're even worse. They've reverted more to their beast and try to cover up who they are even less. This poor supposedly diseased man, though, had really nothing on him. He just armed himself with a bar, which could be used to get some lead. That was about it. Nothing else of interest here. The stranger mounted back up and went on his way, back towards the lonely stead where the old man lived. The old man whose name had been cleared, but he was sure the man wouldn't move back into town. There was no reason. There's nothing good about living in a town. Meanwhile, all the beauty of the countryside was fighting to keep him out here. He was positive he'd stay. He would. And he did. Another man lived in a cottage out here. He had something to say, judging by the look on his face. The stranger wasn't in any mood to hear it. He was on a mission. He had things to accomplish. Couldn't just sit around doing nothing. That wasn't his style. That wasn't what got him to where he was. Where he is. Maybe the stranger had something to prove. Prove that he wasn't any worse off than any of these non-cloned natural humans. But oh well. It's too late for that now. He consulted his map again. He wasn't really sure where the old man lived. He knew it was on one side of the canyon or the other. He continued on, and his horse grew tired and tired. He'd have to either give it a rest or feed it pretty soon, or else it would collapse of exhaustion. The cactuses and the hordes of prairie chickens told him that he was getting closer to his destination. The makeshift fence along the walkway that would really keep nobody out made him sure. And there it was, the old run-down house with broken down cars, the barely running pickup truck, and the old man himself. He claimed that he'd return to town soon, but you never know. He'd be crazy to do that. Then again, he was a pretty crazy old man. The stranger didn't really care about town politics, or the old man himself. He'd do what he was asked, because he knew there were caps in it for him. Chips. Chips were waiting. The horse was growing more and more tired, and soon enough it would just refuse to move forward at all. He might just leave it there. He was close enough to town to not care. Walk the rest of the way. The horse slowed from its gallop and slowly clip-clopped across the barren wastes. He'd dismount soon enough, once they got to the base of the hill, and make his own way up from there. He'd come back to the horse later, feed it a little. Poor animal needed a break anyways. He'd leave it right here, with all this prairie grass for it to munch on. It would be fine by the time he got back. The hill was too steep even for him to climb, but he managed to find his way around it. He decided he'd talk to the woman on the bridge first, see what she had to offer in exchange for that poor man's life. Poor in the literal sense. The stranger didn't really feel much compassion for him. At some point, he'd learn how to craft powder, and then he'd be able to use a real gun instead of this little air-powered plinker. Shooting little lead caltrops at people, or copper in this case. It was easier to find. Didn't really make much of a difference if it's traveling fast enough to pierce through skin. People and animals will die to it, which was just fine by him. He'd crafted this model personally himself. The scope had come from an older version, so it didn't really have much of a zoom. But then again, you really didn't need one.
No questions? Good.
The woman gave him his reward, and then asked him to return to town anyways. What a waste. No money. The car surprisingly yields some leather. I guess that's what the trash can was carrying when the poor thing was stranded on the bridge. The wanderer felt better. All of his time wandering around today, he reflected on what he'd done before the sun had set. He'd felt more intelligent, more cunning, better with his rifles, more able to move in armor, and a number of other things, which weren't as important in his mind. All the little bits and pieces coming together. All the necessary constructions for surviving in the wasteland. They were making themselves apparent to him, laying themselves bare. And he knew it.
Listen to me. Don't waste time.
That the man's name had been cleared.
Now you know. I'll spell it. Carry it out. Just the... I'll be here. All right, listen closely. Now you know.
The sergeant wanted him to kill another man. Meanwhile, Cal was quite intent that he go talk to some other person. He seemed quite concerned about this whole traitor menace thing. He knew where Lewis May was. He'd run into him in the hovels of little makeshift steel domes, somewhere over to one end of town, right next to the megaphones that he was sure used to be blaring all sorts of propagandist messages across the settlement. Before the war, or after the war, or during the war, whenever it is people pray propaganda. Crude poison resistance. A science merchant would probably have some of that.
All my stuff is, it's top notch. It's the best.
Maybe not. Maybe it wasn't at all.
Sometimes standard issue isn't good enough.
The science trainer specifically was quite interested in selling him some gunpowder formulas and some optics as well. He decided to buy the optics and leave the gunpowder
Only had
for
one
later.
owner, but he doesn't need it anymore.
Several ingredients for a toxic neuralizer to use on the traveler poison. A crude poison resistance-ish. Maybe the nature woman in town would know something about that. He wasn't really sure. He didn't really enjoy talking to the people of the town, so he didn't do it much. The mutagenics merchant.
I think we can help each other.
Nothing of interest there. Just people who want to radiate themselves further in an attempt to become the new Superman. No, that wasn't something that the Wander wanted to do. He liked being natural, or as natural as a clone
Here's
can
what's
be.
available.
The trade skill merchant could tell him how to mine iron
what
properly,
are you looking
amongst
for?
other things. It was interesting, but not that interesting. Crude poison resistance. Huh. Huh. The Wanderer decided to drop by the auctioneer, see if he had what was needed, or could at least tell him where to look. The auctioneer tended to know the value of items, as well as what they actually were. The auctioneer misheard him the first time, but heard him the second time around. Crude poison resistances were on sale everywhere. You could buy it quite quickly, and could expect it in the mail. It was all the items that came from the auctioneer. Dabbling in poisons and politics. What was he thinking? Took all the items that came into his mailbox and left as quickly as possible. Before anyone else decided to attempt to deliver them something or grab them something. God, people were so the opposite of self-sufficient before, during, and after the apocalypse. He had enough scraps and enough money to build himself some new slug throwers, but he wasn't sure whether he wanted to wait or just build something more useful. 35, 45. Plastic scraps. Ugh. Still needed more steel. Iron. Wood. Was a whole bevy of items for anything. Optics 1 schematics were barely usable to him. Wasn't really much of a scientist. As he looked over the horizon, he saw the sun setting and decided it'd be a good time to go to sleep. He'd be back in the morning, doing his things, taking care of business, but for now, it was the wrong time. The completely wrong time. And so this has been Fallen Earth episodes 1. I hope you maybe enjoyed it, maybe didn't. I don't know. I felt like doing something different. So yeah. What's good? This is the end of episodes number 1, I guess. Ish.